This video will discuss the proof for evolution. Of course, if you've looked at the introductory video on the home page or just looked at the name of this website and the name of the ebook, you'll realize that I'm not going to present any positive proof here to prove up the theory of evolution. In fact, it'll be just the opposite. I'll show you that there has been no positive proof yet found, but in addition to that, there's some negative proof. Both of those instances demonstrate that evolution theory is not true as a science. Let's take a look at the scientific theory for evolution. Hopefully you have observed the video on the scientific method and remember that there were 5 steps to the scientific method, all of which must be accomplished in order for the individual theory to become a science. And we'll look at the 5 steps here, and as you are probably guessing, we'll demonstrate to you that evolution theory has not achieved the last 2 steps, steps 4 and 5, and therefore, in very technical terms, is not yet a science. It's a scientific theory. So let's look at what the scientific method steps say for scientific theory of evolution. First of all, there was an observation step, step number 1, and Darwin observed a general similarity between fossilized plants and animals. He had collected fossils, he had collected specimens of living beings and studied them, and it became apparent to him that there was a similarity. If you line up all the plants and all the animals and fossils and or living that he had accumulated on his several trips around the world, and he noted that, gee, this one could have been the precursor to that one, and that one could then evolve into that one. And so he ended up with his breathtaking observation as part of the theory that there was a great similarity and that one could have descended from another. He also observed that the oldest beings that he encounters seemed to be the simplest. There was a little bit of geological timing known at that time, and when a fossil was found in a very old geologic structure, that seemed to be the simplest that was found. And so he observed that the oldest beings were the simplest, and that also added fuel to the idea that one could have descended from another or ascended from another. He also observed that some living beings were extinct. This was known already, that some fossils of dinosaurs had been discovered, and other beings that didn't seem to be present in today's Earth. And a particular example here, of course, was the dinosaurs that lived between about 100 million and 300 million years ago and became extinct. So the survival of the fittest idea came as a result of that. So let's look a little bit more at the theory then. In his theory, very specifically, all living beings descended one from another. We'll see that it started with a single-celled being that began living for unknown reasons, and then that single-celled being was in effect the original parent of all other plants and animals. All other plants and animals evolved one from another, and given a very long amount of time to be able to do that. He added to it the concept that only the fittest survived. It was a jungle out there, I guess you'd say, and that only those that had the particular tools to survive would survive, and those that were slightly weaker or didn't have the ability to adapt to changing conditions on Earth, from low oxygen to ice ages to desert environment and all that. If you didn't have the ability to adapt to that, you would not survive. So survival of the fittest became an integral part of it. The major thing was that there were very small steps in between species. It wouldn't just appear a new species, but there would be a very long length of time during which very small adaptations and something called mutations, actually genetic mutations, you'll understand a little bit of that in later videos. The genetic mutations could cause the species to evolve from itself into a slightly different species, and then over a long expanse of time with a lot of small steps could end up in a brand new species, significantly different from the original species. And so the idea of small steps is very important in this theory. Now, at the time, Darwin had a relatively small fossil uh, database that he himself has connected and that he knew about from others in museums, etc., as well as the living plant and animal database. Other people, including him, were studying and accumulating a number of different plant and animal species and trying to categorize these into different types and kind of line them up in a row in some sense. And so at the time of Darwin's writing and observing, the relatively small fossil and plant and animal database just seemed to be consistent with this sort of thing. It was certainly possible that one descended from another and some died out because of not being able to compete for life. And so it was at the initial stages, it looked like it was a reasonably good uh, idea, and it proceeded as a scientific theory at this point through step three. Well, Darwin, in his book, and subsequent people that have worked in this area accept these as things that should be the result of evolution theory, predictions that should be true. And he made two major predictions. And let's look at these under 4A and 4B. Number one, with the idea of very small steps in between the evolution of one species into another, Darwin felt that there should be very many intermediate fossils found in between one species and another. They subsequently became known as missing links. And the general idea was here that, say, for example, if you had a fish and that fish would slowly evolve into an amphibian. A fish would develop a few protuberances here and there, and ultimately, over a long period of time, they would maybe evolve feet, and then lungs would develop, and all these sorts of small changes would slowly happen, and that result being the evolution of a fish into an amphibian. And Darwin was sure and was very optimistic that there should be an extremely large number of these fossils should be found, and they should be found soon. The only thing he felt that was holding up the discovery of fossils at his day and age was that geology was not a very advanced science, and we just had to wait for the geologists to find the right place to look. And if they started looking at the right place, they would find a large number, a plethora of missing link fossils that would validate his theory, demonstrating one species evolving into another. Darwin also made a prediction, I guess, in a sense, but also he spent a number of chapters in his book uh, worried about the fact that in some of these fossils, mainly, he was thinking about, but in living beings as well, that there would be a very complex part might be found of some of these beings that would not be real consistent with this slow evolution process. In other words, some part of an existing plant or animal was really complex, and it was so complex that it's obvious it would take a very long time to evolve into that complex part of this being. And if so, it would conflict with the survival of the fittest concept, such that, let's say, if that whatever that thing was, let's just say it's an eye, for example. If an eye were, a quarter done or half done or a third done, but wouldn't function until it was all done, the eye would just die out by survival of the fittest. It would not be useful to the animal. It couldn't see the predators, let's just say, and until it was all done, and therefore it probably would not have continued to evolve over a long period of time with many small steps, because it would have been useless until absolutely done. And so Darwin was very concerned about this, that complex parts, complex organs was the term, could be found, and he talked quite a bit about how that probably would not happen, and if it happened, there might be some other explanation, some such, but he didn't get in too far into the explanations, but he basically argued that it should not be found. Let's take a look here at the fossil data for plants and animals. That was the first thing that Darwin observed, and paleontologists are the current scientific discipline where fossils are gathered, studied, and grouped and tried to be explained as to where they came from and what they represent. And so paleontologists have found millions of fossils to this point. And what I've shown here in this slide, in this figure, is a plot of about 1,000, a little over 1,000 data points. Each one of these black dots is a fossil that was discovered and given an age somewhere. And let's just look at an example of algae. For example, this red arrow here is pointing toward the first algae that was found at about 500 million years ago. And then there are a bunch of younger algae that were discovered in younger rocks, indicating that they are algae, but they were algae continued to live, and in fact, to this day, we still have algae. So the important point of this column is the highest point, which indicated that the first algae occurred about 500 million years ago. That was the first appearance of an algae, and all the rest of the algae are ancestors of that original algae. And so each one of the columns in this figure represent that same sort of a concept. There is a column of data, and the top point represents here for insects, the top point represents the first insect that appeared or the first fish that appeared, and the same for all the rest of these. And that's the interesting point that we want to look at here to see when the earliest of an individual species appeared. Now, there are a couple of things about this slide, this figure, but one thing actually is circumstantial evidence support for at least for the initial concept that Darwin had, and that is that with time, the simplest, and these are very simple, these are 9 areas of the world that have found some fossils and very ancient rocks, and these are basically all plant seeds, all plants are found here, and they're simplest. And then we get to various animals here, from algae to sponges to mollusks to insects to fish to lizards and mammals and finally humans, showing that the transition is from simplest to most complex beings. And so that part that Darwin had observed is true, is a positive, that there are simplest beings first and more complex that appear later on, which leaves open the possibility that evolution could be true. But at this point, it's only circumstantial evidence. Now, this slide also shows some problems, of course, and that's the negative part of what has been observed in the fossil record. The appearance of all plants and no animals for the first about 3 billion years is a significant problem. Now, these 9 areas have been studied extensively, and I think the jury is finally in, as of about December of 2011, that all of these fossils are plants. So they're all plants. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that, and we'll see in the next slide, something called the Precambrian explosion of the appearance of plants and animals. And there should, for these types of algae, sponges, mollusks, etc., there should be some animals up here that, in this concept of slow steps and slow changes, there should be some animals up here, and there should not be all of a sudden a whole bunch of plants and animals appearing here as well-defined species. And so that's a problem with what we'll see in the next slide, the Cambrian explosion. Now here is that basically that same set of data points, just showing the lower part of them, the 9 plants that were found, 9 areas of plants that were found are not shown on this slide. So we're just talking about basically from about 525 million years ago to the present. And so here are all of these data points, and the difficulty is that in a very short amount of time, at least geologically speaking, all of a sudden all of these plants and animals here, from algae up through mollusks at least, if not including fish as well, those species appeared rather quickly, and that is inconsistent. There should be some precursors, there should be some slow steps in between. It shouldn't happen all of a sudden, and so that conflicts with the many and short steps that is part of the theory of evolution. Now, some very recent, last couple of decades anyway, recent in the time scale of evolution theory, have come up with some concepts to explain that. They are given names such as adaptive radiation, meaning that new species just kind of radiate from one species, and result in a whole bunch of species formed at once. The other concept is something called punctuated equilibrium, meaning that everything was kind of going at sort of equilibrium conditions with very little changing, and then all of a sudden at a point a whole bunch of species are formed, and then after they're formed it goes back to this equilibrium situation. Now they're proffered as quasi-scientific explanations for what happened, but in reality, if you think about it a little bit, basically what they're saying is, well, all of a sudden these species appeared without in conflict with evolution theory, so let's just say all of a sudden these species appeared and given them different names, and kind of have a deviation from the theory and say, well, it just happened. And that's not really science, to say, when you observe something that has happened, to say, well, my scientific view now is that it did happen, and here's a name for it. Anyone who has a slight bit of religious experience would term both of these things, adaptive radiation and punctuated equilibrium, as miracles, something that are unexplained that just happened. So anyway, this is a problem with the fossil record for evolution, and it has not proven that evolution is true in any sense to this point. Now, the other part of evolution theory, part 4A, as we remember, was that there should be a whole bunch of missing link fossils found. Missing link fossils should be found between basically all different species of plants and all different species of animals, including the fossils, the intermediate fossils between humans and their precursor. Current day evolutionists believe that the chimpanzee is the original donor, or the original species that over a long period of time transformed into human beings. So there should be some fossils in between chimpanzees and humans. And of course, over these last 150 years, there has been a lot of searching for these missing link fossils, and to date, none, zero, have been found. There has been some searching for these intermediate fossils between various species of plants and animals, but the bulk of the search has been for the intermediate fossils, or the missing links between humans and their predecessor. Of course, the reason for this is that's the top transition to find, and I think if we found a whole bunch of transition fossils, missing link fossils between humans and, let's just say, a chimpanzee, then that would in effect prove all the rest, and you would not have to bother to try to find all these other missing link fossils. But indeed, that has not occurred in any event, and let's just look at the missing human link fossils that have been proffered over the years, but all have turned out to be failures. You may have heard of Neanderthals. They were discovered in Germany, and actually before Darwin's publication in 1856, and since then a large number of Neanderthal species fossils have been found, and to the point where in recent years a amount of DNA was put together, and so we know now the DNA of a Neanderthal, and it is not the DNA of humans, so we know that it's not human. The Java man was a similar sort of situation, discovered in Indonesia and proven now to be not human. There was at least one fraud in there where someone took the skull of I think of a monkey, and just kind of pasted it onto a human-type skull, a human-type body, and tried to call that in some kind of a human missing link. It was very quickly discovered as a fraud. Later ones with Peking Man and Lucy were for a while thought to be missing human links, but again proven when a closer look was taken that they were not. In particular, Lucy was proven to be a monkey, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Now the last one that has appeared on the scene was in 1983, and let's just talk a little bit about it. It's called Darwinius maselli. It was discovered in 1983 in Germany, and at the time it was a worldwide sensation. The BBC, the New York Times, all the networks, television networks at the time, had it as their top story once it was announced, and it went on. That this was finally the proof for evolution. This was finally the missing link between humans and their predecessors, and it would prove evolution be true. There were a couple of things about this fossil that initially led to this idea, and it was things like an opposed thumb that this creature had, and there was something about the pelvic area that was indicating that it might have been a human predecessor. This discovery was, as I said, a worldwide sensation. A technical paper was written very rapidly about it. That technical paper was accepted at probably world record speed, and it was presented before an audience at a conference that just happened to coincide with the timing of this. And again, it was a worldwide sensation, big, big news. It wasn't but a couple of months later that the entire thing fell apart. It was withdrawn. The authors basically said, sorry, and it was shown that this indeed was a monkey, that it was not a missing link for humans. And so this is the last one that's been found. I do not doubt that there will be additional missing link fossils found in the future, but the prospects do not look good that any significant human missing links will be found, or for that matter, any other missing links between any other species of plants and animals. Now, in terms of, if you remember from point 4b, Darwin was very concerned about the possibility that some complex organs might be found, things that were so complex that they would not be able to have been evolved slowly and yet not violate this survival of the fittest concept. And hopefully you've looked at the cells video that preceded this video, and you really remember that, my gosh, a cell in what it does is extremely complex. It has these little things that occur, molecular transporters and plant areas within the nucleus of the cell that do manufacturing and quality control and all these sorts of things. This is an example that Darwin feared of a complex organ which cannot be explained within the current purview of evolution theory. This living cell video hopefully gave you a reasonable amount of information, but if you're really gung-ho, there is a book called Cells that you can find in the reference list. It is written by some cell biologists. It's actually a graduate level cell biology book. It contains an extreme amount of detail that only the most hardy can read if you're not a cell biologist, but I did read it and did learn quite a bit about what we know about how cells behave, and it is indeed extremely complex. So the basic idea is that this is a complex organ. It is a negative finding for evolution and in effect disproves evolution. And so this would need to be explained in a modified evolution theory, or the theory would need to be discarded. Now, cells are not the only thing that are complex organ. When you see a later video on DNA, you will realize how beautifully complex and wonderfully functioning DNA is, that it is also a complex organ. And other authors have written about things like the development of eyes and even the flagellum tails, the proportional method that bacteria have to swim in liquids is so complex that it too could not have developed slowly and still have remained its useful part of the evolution cycle. In any event, so this is a second reason. First of all, no missing link fossils. That's negative proof that shows that evolution is not true. And then the finding of this is negative proof, or it's positive in a negative sense, I guess I could say, to show that evolution is not true. Let's take a look at another part of evolution evidence, so-called, that is circumstantial evolution evidence. It's not scientific proof. It's just circumstances that could ultimately be transmuted into proof. And it's shown in the picture at the center here. I've shown here is something that I constructed, a monkey, and then an ape, and then a human carrying a briefcase. It's a potential picture of the transformation of one species into another species. And there are some well-defined scientific areas of evolution theory called homology, comparative anatomy, and phylogenetics. And these areas are basically trying to study a series of different species of similar animals and try to discern that one could have evolved from another by not only lining up a picture of their similar structure, but studying the muscle structure, studying the bone structure, and noting that, say, one particular species has a bone structure that is almost identical to a later species, and therefore that could have evolved from the first species into the second species. That sort of reasoning. If you've taken a biology course or that involves some discussion of evolution, which is most biology courses these days, even as long as 40 or 50 years ago, you might have seen a more detailed picture like this that shows 8 or 10 beings, including perhaps starting out with a monkey and having various gorillas and apes and Neanderthals and all sorts of other similar sorts of animals in the picture, and then ending up in a human being, giving you the idea, well, here's what could have happened. This one transitioned into that, into that, into that, and finally ended up in a human being. Uh, those people who do not believe that sort of a thing, and of course it's not something that you can prove, it's just a circumstantial case, come up with pictures something like this. This is the one I constructed. Here I've got a Model T Ford, I've got a 30s coupe, and a Formula One race car. And of course no one would contend that one evolved into another all by itself, but what is true, at least of this lower picture here, is that there was a good initial design with 4 wheels with a certain length, a certain width, and a certain height that allowed the Model T Ford to be stable on the road and not fall over and curves, etc. And that general blueprint, that general plan was carried forth in basically all cars since. We all have cars of a certain length and a certain width and a certain height, and the net result is that they all function very well, and it's as a result of good design, not a result of evolution one into another. And so the argument can be made that any picture you come up with creatures, in this case creatures with 2 legs and 2 arms, all in the same picture, they just are benefit from the good design that is needed for the Earth's gravitational structure that we have, so that they can walk and perform and do what they need to do with their arms and legs as a result of good design. So let's just put this all together. You've seen all of this, at least 1 through 4A and B in a prior slide, but let's just look at that and put it all together. It's the same top up here, and the same 4A and 4B, and then the negative results for the predictions. No missing links were found, though there should have been, and complex organs were found, though they should not have been. And so this whole steps 1 through 5 have not been completed successfully. The only thing that has been completed so far for evolution theory is steps 1 through 3, which deem it a correlation. A scientific theory is that it is a correlation, but has not yet reached the status of a science. And so, as I've said a number of times, the theory must be modified, and making perhaps additional predictions to possibly find them be positively true and all that, but the theory needs to be changed in order to become true. At this point, evolution theory is not true. Here's just kind of a checklist showing that there is one beneficial thing that has been found that's consistent with evolution theory, and that is the idea of simplest living beings are the ones that are in the oldest geologic ages. So the simplest are the oldest, the more complex are the youngest, and of course we're going to see later on, of course, that's exactly what biblical creation predicts in the first chapter of Genesis, that there should be plants first, and then sea creatures, and then land animals, etc. So it's not unique to evolution to have discovered this, but it's consistent, and so at least it's a somewhat of a positive point for evolution theory. The rest of these points you've already seen, that plant seeds are found billions of years old, but there should be animals there, and there were no animals. So with no animals as ancestors to the animals that appeared very quickly, that's a significant problem. And there are very few plants found, at least in those early ages too, and then a large explosion of different plants appeared, so it's a problem for both animals and plants. The problem of missing link fossils, I've emphasized 150 years of searching, none have been found, nothing yet, and then finding that complex organs have been found in not only cells and DNA and eyes, but a bunch of other things that are too complex to evolve slowly over time. So the bottom line is that evolution is not true. It, in fact, is disproven. So bear with me one last time when I beat this to submission here, that in effect evolution is not a science. It's only an empirical correlation at this time. It has the possibility of becoming a science with time, but at this point it is not. It is only a theory. And the scientific truth must be found to make it a discipline. They got to find some missing link fossils, and complex organs need to be explained, or the theory needs to be significantly modified. And I think that's what needs to be done. The theory needs to be significantly modified or dropped. Thank you for looking at this series of videos to this point. What you will see beyond this is a number of videos about the biblical creation side of things. For those of you who are not Bible believers, I hope this won't scare you away. What I'm going to do is take a look at the biblical creation story and look at scientific discipline, scientific evidence that not proves it, since biblical creation, you will see, is a history. It's not a science. But we will find that there are a lot of scientific areas and developments that give technical support to the historical account seen in the Genesis account of biblical creation. Hope you'll look at the rest of these and continue to have an open mind and reserve your judgment until we get to the tail end. It's a total of 15 videos in this site, and so it's a little over 4 hours worth of looking. So if you got to this point, you're part way into it. I congratulate you and thank you for continuing to look at these videos.